Welcome to Unit 4 on tracking progress in advocating for an enabling environment for evaluation. My name is Julia Kaufman, and I am the Director of the Center for Evaluation Innovation. This video lecture is going to take you through two main topics. The first is on challenges in monitoring and evaluating advocacy, as well as ways to address some of those challenges. And the second is on planning, advocacy, monitoring, and evaluation, and the sequence of steps that we suggest that you consider as you go through that planning process. So we'll start with the first topic on challenges in monitoring and evaluating advocacy. And we want to just start with a general principle about how you might think about positioning the evaluation of advocacy. So because advocacy strategies are unique or somewhat unique in that they tend to adapt over time in response to changing conditions and changing variables in the environment, this presents a really great and unique opportunity to really use evaluation as the advocacy strategy is being implemented to inform how it's going over time, to identify if there are opportunities for mid-course corrections. So it's a real opportunity to have a very user and utilization focused approach to advocacy evaluation. So let's talk about some of the challenges that we face in thinking about evaluating advocacy. And the first is that there is there can be a long time frame involved. Unlike a program where we can say at the end of 2 or 3 years we expect these changes to have occurred, with advocacy it's more unpredictable, and it can take several years or longer for us to actually achieve a certain advocacy goal. And because of that longer time frame, we've got reporting requirements that tend to come on a shorter time frame. A solution for that challenge is to identify interim outcomes that signal progress is being made toward the goal, so that you can say, well, we haven't yet achieved the goal, but we are tracking the progress that we're making, so we know we're advancing toward that goal. The second challenge is complexity and attribution. And this is the notion that it's difficult with advocacy because it takes place in a complex environment and because there are a lot of variables that affect the implementation and success of an advocacy strategy. It's difficult to establish with certainty sort of a cause and effect relationship between the advocacy work that was done and any outcomes that were achieved. And so the solution there is to think not so much about definitively attributing a particular outcome to an advocacy effort, but instead thinking about how we can show that the advocacy effort has made a unique contribution to that outcome. So it's thinking about contribution instead of attribution. Another challenge related to the long time frame that we just talked about is that advocacy can be really unpredictable. And again, this goes back to the fact that it takes place in a complex environment, and there can be certain unexpected or unanticipated circumstances often related to politics that may mean we need to take a pause in the strategy, or we need to shift things as we go along. And again, because of that unpredictability, it's useful to identify interim outcomes along the way and to really be tracking, are we making progress even if we're not yet at that ultimate goal. And finally, the challenge, the fourth challenge is, again, related to what we've talked about already, but the fact that advocacy plans are rarely implemented with full fidelity, or at least the beginning plan is rarely implemented that way because of that unpredictability, because of complexity it usually becomes necessary to revisit the plan periodically to adapt advocacy strategies and adjust to whatever the environment is or whatever the evaluation is telling you you need to do at the time to adjust. So what that means is that we regularly have to monitor the strategy to check if changes have happened or if changes are needed, and then to adjust our monitoring and evaluation plan accordingly if we need to shift what our focus is. Okay. Let's move on now to talking about how to think about the planning of advocacy monitoring and evaluation and the sequence of steps and principles that we recommend that we think about here. And let's start with some general principles. And like I said earlier, it's really useful to use evaluation to support learning on advocacy and to support adjustment over time. And for that reason, it's useful to really start the evaluation planning process at the start of the advocacy effort. It can be really useful for both planning the advocacy effort, for supporting it during its implementation, and then at the end to look back and say, you know, how much success have we achieved and what contribution did the advocacy effort make to that success. Another principle is that there is no one single right approach or roadmap for evaluating advocacy, and we have to think about who the evaluation users are and the questions that they're asking, and the answers to those questions will drive the approach to evaluation that we use, and we're going to get more into that and what that means in a second. But I also want to make the point here that the questions that users have will likely differ depending on the advocacy goal, and there are different goals that we might be after with advocacy, including the development of evaluation policies, engagement of the public sector or grassroots support, or, for example, the development of useful partnerships. So let's get into the steps involved with planning advocacy, monitoring, and evaluation, and there are 5 of these that we're going to go through one by one. The first is the question of who are the monitoring and evaluation users. So who's the primary audience for what the evaluation is going to focus on? And there can be various users that might be the focus. They can include advocacy organizations or advocates themselves and their partners. It can include external donors or who's funding the advocacy effort. It can also include allies of the advocacy effort. You see the list on the slide there. And finally, it can include other external users, so the media or others outside of the advocacy effort who are interested in learning about what happened and why. So that's really the first important decision, which is going to drive or sort of help channel the rest of the decisions that get made during the planning process. So once you decide who the main users are, and an additional point I should make about that is it's not just important to identify who the users are, because there can be multiple audiences for monitoring and evaluation, but it's also important to think about who the primary users are. So there can be primary and secondary and sometimes even tertiary users, but think about who's the main audience for this work. And then once you decide that, the second question is, how will monitoring and evaluation be used? So given who the main users are, what do they want to know? What questions are they going to have about the advocacy effort? And that can include, for example, accountability and transparency, which really means, you know, did the advocacy effort do what it intended to do, and did it accomplish what it set out to accomplish? More of the accountability and impact question. And you know, various users may be interested in that, but that's often a common question for external donors. The second possible use is informing decision making. And the main user who's usually interested in that purpose tends to be advocates. So this is about supporting their learning and supporting their strategic decision making over time as the advocacy effort is being implemented. External donors may also be interested in, if and how the advocacy effort is adapting over time. But that purpose tends to be most often associated with advocates themselves. And the third purpose is national and global learning. And this is the idea of identifying transferable lessons that others will be interested in extrapolating from this advocacy effort and applying to others in the future. So the first, again, is who are the users? The second is how do they want to use the monitoring and evaluation? The third question, once you've decided on the first two, is to think about the evaluation design that should be used. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. The materials that go along with this lecture provide much more information on that. But just to make a point that a lot of these designs are based on a mix of different methods that include observation, interviews, documentation, and case studies. But some of the common sort of general designs that go with the three purposes we just talked about include for accountability and looking at impact. We often use designs that that incorporate single case studies, really going in depth on a particular advocacy effort, or comparing advocacy efforts that may be taking place in different locations to see what happened in those, and looking comparatively about the progress that was achieved and how that may have looked differently in different places or across different issues. Contribution analysis is another design, and that is an approach that really goes back and systematically and rigorously looks at impact and the contribution that an advocacy effort made to a particular outcome that was observed. Or another design option here may be performance monitoring, and this really gets at the accountability purpose of, did the advocacy effort play out as it was expected to? What can we show to along the way to show that performance was happening as it was intended? The second, for informing decision making, really a design's designed to inform strategic learning, and there are various sort of real-time or developmental evaluation designs that are a good fit here, where the evaluator really becomes embedded in the advocacy team and really thinks about what are the strategic questions that the team is facing, and how can evaluation collect data along the way to support those decisions. And finally, for the third purpose of national and global learning, those are often retrospective case studies that are done of either successful or even failed advocacy attempts, to go back and look at what did we learn from success and failure that has transferability to other advocacy efforts. And again, there's much more detail in the accompanying materials. Question 4, once you decide on evaluation design, then you can really identify what should be measured. And this is going to be driven by what the answers to the first 3 questions, as well as what the advocacy strategy itself includes. So various options here to mention briefly. You may want to look at activities that are being implemented and their outputs. And this is really relevant if you're interested in monitoring performance over time. So you'd look at what's happening with digital outreach, for example, the media partnerships or advocacy that's happening, coalition building if that's relevant to the advocacy strategy, and really sort of counting what was done or how much of something was done, just to show and track implementation over time. The second option there is interim outcomes, and this really gets at what's changing as a result of our activities. Not just are we implementing activities, but what's changing along the way as a result of them. So are we generating new partnerships, and who's included in them? Are new advocates and champions being developed? Are we increasing political will on this issue, or how is the constituency itself growing? So again, what is happening along the way as a direct result of the advocacy activities? In addition, of course, you want to look at whether the advocacy goal has been achieved. And there are various options here in terms of the goal that the strategy might be after. The most common is the adoption of a particular policy, but there are others that the strategy may be focused on, including the development of policy itself. Sometimes that's a huge achievement to get a policy developed and on the agenda. It could also mean blocking a harmful or a potentially harmful policy, or it could be, after a policy has been adopted, really tracking the implementation of it, or making sure that it sustains over time. If, for example, budget cuts happen, the goal may be making sure that policy stays in place. And finally, the last category is one that monitoring and evaluation of advocacy often doesn't pay attention to, but it's really important to think about if a particular policy has been adapted, is it actually playing out for that policy's intended beneficiaries as it was expected to? Who's benefiting? Are systems changing? What is happening as a result of a particular policy? So those are options that might be the target of a monitoring and evaluation of advocacy. And again, it's going to depend on the answers to the 3 questions we've already been through, as well as how that advocacy strategy has been shaped and what it actually consists of. This is more like a menu of options to consider. And finally, the last question is what data collection methods or tools should be used. And the same sort of tools and methods that apply to all evaluation also apply to advocacy. So the typical methods or common methods include interviews or surveys of advocacy audiences or actors. But there's also a set of other more unique advocacy methods and tools that have been developed. And again, accompanying materials to this lecture lay out in much more detail. But just to alert you to the fact that some unique methods, often based on interviews or based on surveys, exist out there. And there are certain tools that you may want to use at different stages of the monitoring and evaluation process. So during pre-intervention or prior to the start of the strategy, there are tools that might include assessing the advocacy capacity of an organization or a particular coalition, mapping what a network of advocates looks like, or mapping a system if systems change happens to be the focus of the advocacy strategy, kind of taking a pre-advocacy assessment of what something looks like. During the actual implementation of the advocacy strategy, then there are various methods or tools that you might use to monitor or implement those activities. If media is part of the advocacy strategy, you may want to use a form of media tracking. Intense period debriefs are a sort of a focus group approach to talking with advocates during or after an intense period of activity happens, to really reflect on what's been learned, what happened, what went wrong, what do we want to change in the future. So there are a number of methods that are useful during the implementation of the strategy itself. In addition, then, when we get to thinking about the interim outcomes for advocacy audiences, there are a variety of methods there that may be useful, and these are really focused on talking to those audiences that are expected to change as a result of the advocacy work. And those may be members of the public, those may be certain audiences that have influence in the policy process, like a business community or important NGOs who have an influential voice on an issue, or it may mean policymakers themselves. And so you see on the slide there are some options there in terms of how to capture that information, like research panels, a methodology that works well with advocacy called the Bellwether methodology, policymaker ratings, and again, much more detail in the accompanying materials on what those methods are and how to find additional resources on them. And then finally, looking at policy or system change results, using policy tracking or going back to some of those tools that we talked about earlier that you might use before the advocacy strategy starts, and doing those a second time or a third time to look at how system mapping, or the system that's the focus of the mapping, changes over time and after advocacy has been done. What's different that we saw in the pre-measure to the post-measure. Okay, some final points to keep in mind in planning and implementing monitoring and evaluation for advocacy. So it's important to think about who the evaluator of the effort should be. And it could be an internal evaluator or it could be an external evaluator. It really depends on a variety of factors, including resources or availability of expertise, as well as the intended purpose and use of the evaluation. So sometimes it may be important to have an external evaluator to establish credibility with the evaluation user. But it could be an internal or external evaluator. The second thing to keep in mind is timing. Again, I've said it several times, but it's really useful to start the monitoring and evaluation effort at the beginning of the advocacy strategy, and then to not just go back to it at the end of the strategy, but to really be collecting data and feeding that data into the advocacy process as it's implemented. And the timing on that really depends on what makes sense for the advocates and for the resources available for the evaluation. But just the principle there of going back to the evaluation regularly, looking at the data regularly, reflecting regularly, and adapting as needed in order to get maximum results possible. And then with impact evaluation, again, just a reminder that we often don't pay attention to monitoring and evaluating what happens after an advocacy goal is achieved. And it's important not only for advocates to think about how they are going to pivot to not just focusing on achieving a particular policy, for example, but how they're going to pivot to supporting its implementation over time. It's also important for with evaluation to think about how is the evaluation going to pivot and shift its focus to really support the implementation. A few final comments to keep in mind. Context matters. So once again, advocacy takes place in a complex environment. It drastically affects often the implementation and planning and ongoing adjustment of advocacy strategies. It often really matters, it also really matters in the interpretation of evaluation results. So what role did context play in the success or failure or the delay of an advocacy strategy? How did politics factor in? What did the role of the opposition play in the strategy? So really incorporating that into the measurement and analysis of what's happening. The reporting out and reflecting on, this is, just a reminder to, as the monitoring and evaluation happens, to really set time apart for reflecting on data, reflecting on experience. It's not just, evaluation data that is brought to the table, but what's the experience of advocates? How should that be interpreted alongside the data? And to really write down, good practices, the lessons learned, and innovations. That documentation is going to be critically useful for both looking back and thinking about what happened in this particular instance, but also for applying to other advocacy work going forward. And a related point there is to manage knowledge. And this means, it's important to, if you're using monitoring and evaluation to support the advocacy strategy, to think about the timing of when data are needed and what the questions that advocates have are going to be, when they're going to have them, and to time data collection accordingly, so it gets to the right people at the right time in a usable form. So that concludes our lecture on monitoring and evaluating advocacy. Thank you very much for participating. And again, please look at the accompanying materials that go along with this lecture to get more in-depth information on what we've talked about today.